The invitation came on golden paper. Not real gold, of course. It was a material the Drun used for formal documents, thin, pressed sheets of a mineral that caught light and held it. When the message arrived at Earth's diplomatic office, the staff stood around it for a moment just looking at it. It was beautiful. It was also the first time the Drun Collective had ever invited humanity to a summit of this level. Director Orrin Hale read it twice at his desk, then set it down and looked out the window at the city below. He was 61 years old. He had spent 30 of those years in public service, first as a regional governor, then as a negotiator, then as the elected head of Earth's unified council. He was not a soldier. He had never wanted to be. His whole life had been built around one idea, that most problems, given enough patience and enough honesty, could be solved without anyone dying. He accepted the invitation. Station Verath was a neutral structure, built jointly by 4 species 200 years ago as a place where disputes could be settled without weapons. It sat at the edge of a quiet star system, far from any single civilization's territory. The air inside was filtered to support multiple biologies. The rooms were wide and clean. The walls were made of a pale stone that absorbed sound, so voices never echoed. Hale arrived with a small team. Captain Dara Moss led his security detail, 8 people in total, lightly armed as the summit protocols required. 2 diplomatic aides, 1 translator. That was it. Hale had insisted on keeping the group small. He believed that showing up with a large armed escort sent the wrong message. The Drun delegation was already waiting when they entered the main chamber. They were tall, nearly 3 meters, with wide shoulders and narrow heads. Their skin was a deep gray-green, and they moved with the slow, deliberate weight of creatures who had never needed to hurry. Ambassador Riva stood at the head of their table, flanked by 6 advisors, and at the far end of the room, a group of individuals in darker clothing who had not been listed on the official delegation manifest. Moss noticed them immediately. She quietly told one of her team to log the discrepancy and transmit it back to Earth. The talks began. Riva opened by discussing the newly charted star cluster, a region of space sitting between Drun and human expansion corridors. It was rich in rare elements. Both civilizations had ships operating near its edges. The Drun position was simple. The cluster belonged to them by right of proximity. Humanity's presence there was, in their words, an inconvenience that needed to be resolved. Hale listened without interrupting. When Riva finished, Hale placed both hands flat on the table and explained, in careful and clear language, that proximity was not ownership under any galactic treaty currently in force. He proposed a joint survey commission, equal membership, shared data, binding arbitration if the commission could not agree. It was a reasonable offer. Several of the Drun advisors exchanged looks. Riva did not look at his advisors. He looked at Hale the way someone looks at an obstacle they have already decided to remove. The session broke for a midday interval. Hale walked to the observation window at the end of the corridor and stood there watching the stars. One of his aides brought him water. Moss stayed close, scanning the hall. When they returned to the chamber, the Drun were already seated. Hale had just pulled out his chair when the sound came, not loud, not dramatic. A short, flat noise like something snapping under pressure. Hale looked down. There was a small entry wound in his chest, just below the left collarbone. He looked at it with a kind of confused calm, as though trying to understand a problem that did not yet make sense. Then he fell. Moss was moving before he hit the floor. She had Hale in her arms in seconds, applying pressure, calling for medical support over the comm. The chamber erupted, Drun delegates standing, human aides shouting, the translator backing against the wall. The individuals in dark clothing at the far end of the room were already moving toward the exits. Moss's team blocked 2 of them. The others got through. Riva stood in the center of the chaos with his hands clasped behind his back. When Moss looked at him across the room, her hands red, Hale's breathing fatting, Riva met her gaze without flinching. He said, in perfectly calm language, that this was clearly the work of a rogue element, that the collective condemned any violence during diplomatic proceedings, that an investigation would of course be conducted. He sounded like he had prepared the statement in advance. Hale died 11 minutes later. Moss was still holding him. She did not cry. She completed her protocols. She locked down every corridor she could access, transmitted the full recording of the chamber, every second of it back to Earth on an emergency channel, and then sat on the floor next to Orrin Hale's body and waited for instructions. The recording arrived on Earth in real time. It played on public screens before the government had a chance to control the broadcast. Billions of people watched Director Hale fall. They watched his hands on the table, his calm voice offering fair terms, and then the sound, and then the floor. They watched Riva's statement. They watched his hands, still clasped behind his back, completely still. Earth went very quiet after that. The Drun ambassador sent a formal condolence message within 6 hours of Hale's death. It was well written, polished, full of the right words: tragedy, shared grief, commitment to peace. It was transmitted to every major news channel in human space and to every galactic diplomatic registry. Several neutral species publicly praised the Drun for their swift response. The Arathi Confederation issued a statement calling for calm on all sides. The Venari Trade Council offered to host preliminary discussions about a formal investigation. Earth did not respond to any of it. Secretary Tomas Eld, who had served as Hale's deputy for 9 years, was sworn in as acting head of government in a small room with no cameras. He signed 3 documents, shook 2 hands, and went directly into a closed session with General Petrasan. That meeting lasted 14 hours. No record of it was released. When Eld finally appeared on public broadcast, he looked tired. He stood at a plain podium with no decorations behind him and no prepared speech on the stand. He spoke for less than 2 minutes. He said that Director Hale had gone to Station Verath in good faith, unarmed, offering a fair proposal. He said that the recording spoke for itself. He said that Earth had noted every statement made by every party in the hours since. Then he said the only thing he intended to say publicly on the matter: "We remember. We are coming." He turned and walked off the podium without answering questions. The galaxy watched this and was uncertain what to make of it. The Drun state media called it grief-speaking. Several political analysts from neutral civilizations said it was a posture, a way for Earth's new leader to appear strong while quietly preparing to negotiate. The Venari Trade Council revised its offer and suggested a compensation framework. A minor species called the Heth sent a message of solidarity to the Drun, noting that humanity had never been a significant military force and that the situation would likely resolve itself commercially. None of them understood what was already happening. General San had begun the mobilization before Eld was even sworn in. She did not wait for authorization because she had standing emergency orders that Hale himself had signed 4 years earlier, a contingency protocol that almost no one outside the Defense Council knew existed. It had never been used. It had been written because Hale believed, with his characteristic quiet logic, that the galaxy respected preparation even when it hoped for peace. Every deep space fleet got the recall signal within 2 hours of his death. Ships that had been on long patrol routes turned around without explanation. Supply depots that had been running at 60% capacity were ordered to full production. Reserve units on 14 different worlds received activation notices. Officers who had retired in the last 5 years received personal calls. Fleet Marshal Dov Crane was fishing when his call came in. He had been on leave for 3 weeks, his first real leave in 4 years. He was standing in a river in cold water up to his knees, holding a rod he had borrowed from his neighbor, not catching anything and not particularly trying to. His personal comm had been set to emergency only. When it buzzed, he looked at the identifier, set the rod carefully against a rock, and waded back to shore. He was at the military spaceport by evening. Crane was 64 years old and had commanded fleets in 2 border conflicts and 1 major engagement against a pirate coalition that had briefly controlled 3 transit corridors. He was not loud. He was not dramatic. He had a reputation among his officers for speaking in short sentences and expecting long preparation. His crews trusted him completely because he had never once sent them somewhere he had not already thought through from every angle. When he reviewed the full mobilization order, he made 17 amendments in the first hour. Not changes to the objective, changes to the sequencing, the supply lines, the staging positions. He wanted every ship in position before the Drun had time to fully understand what was being assembled. The Drun Military Intelligence Service did eventually detect activity. Their analysts filed a report noting unusual fleet movements in human space and recommended increased monitoring. High Warlord Breck, who commanded the Drun Collective's armed forces, reviewed the report and rated it low priority. He had fought 3 wars. He knew what a civilization preparing for serious conflict looked like. What he saw from Earth looked like noise, a political theater for a domestic audience. He did not upgrade the rating. On the 14th day after Hale's death, Captain Dara Moss returned to Earth. She had been kept on Station Verath for the initial investigation period, giving testimony, submitting reports, watching neutral observers catalog every centimeter of the chamber where her director had died. She had done all of it correctly and completely. When she landed, General San met her personally on the tarmac. That was unusual. San did not typically meet returning personnel. Moss stood in front of her, still in her travel clothes, and waited. San looked at her for a moment and then said, "I need you to go back out there. Different role." She handed Moss a sealed assignment folder. "Eld wants someone in that chair who was actually in that room." Moss took the folder. She did not open it yet. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Fleet Marshal Crane departs in 6 days, San said. "You'll be on his command ship." Moss nodded once. Then she asked if she had time to visit Hale's memorial before departure. San told her she had all 6 days. Moss went alone the next morning before the site opened to the public. She stood there for a long time without speaking. Then she straightened her jacket and left to pack. Relay Officer San was 22 years old and had been stationed at Verath's Edge for 8 months. It was a quiet post. Verath's Edge was the outermost defense line of the Drun Collective, a system with 2 cold planets, a debris field, and a small installation that monitored traffic along the human approach corridor. Nothing ever happened there. San had been assigned to it because she was good at her job, and her supervisor had run out of reasons to give her a better position. She spent most of her shifts reading. She was reading when the first sensor ping came in. She almost marked it as debris interference. She had seen that kind of ghost signal before, large mass readings that turned out to be ice clusters drifting through the field. But the ping repeated, and then it multiplied, and then the display on her console started showing more contacts than she had ever seen in a single field. She recalibrated the sensors twice. The contacts remained. She counted them. Then she counted again. Then she opened a direct line to Commodore Nesh, who commanded the Frontier Defense Fleet, and told him she needed him to look at her screen personally because she did not trust herself to describe what she was seeing accurately. Nesh arrived in the relay room 90 seconds later. He looked at her display. He said nothing for a long moment. The human fleet came out of transit at the edge of the debris field, in a formation that Nesh had never seen used operationally, spread wide, layered in 3 distinct depth bands. Each band staggered so that no 2 ships were blocking another's firing solution. It was not an aggressive formation. It was a precise one. It said, without any words, that the people flying these ships had thought carefully about every angle before they arrived. Nesh broadcast the warning immediately. Standard protocol, identify, challenge, demand response. He sent it on every frequency the Drun used, and on the registered human diplomatic bands as well. Fleet Marshal Crane received the warning on his command ship. He read it. He handed the datapad back to his communications officer and said, "Continue on course." That was the entirety of his response. Nesh had 41 warships at Verath's edge. They were solid vessels, mid-range cruisers mostly, with 6 heavy destroyers and a handful of patrol craft. In any normal engagement, 41 warships defending a prepared position against an incoming force was a meaningful number. The debris field gave them cover options. The installation had long-range targeting systems. Nesh had run simulations of this exact scenario for 3 years. None of the simulations had included a fleet this size. He broadcast a second warning, then a third. Then he ordered his ships to battle formation and told his crew to prepare for engagement. He was not panicking. He was a professional. He gave his orders clearly, and his crew executed them without hesitation. The human fleet did not slow down. What happened over the next 4 hours was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a lesson in the difference between a force defending a position and a force that had spent 2 weeks in transit doing nothing but preparing for this exact engagement. Crane's fleet worked in coordinated sections, one group suppressing the installation's targeting systems with precision jamming, another engaging the Drun cruisers directly, a third moving through the debris field along routes that had been pre-mapped from long-range scans taken weeks earlier. Nesh's ships fought hard. Several human vessels took significant damage. One destroyer was lost, but every time Nesh tried to consolidate his forces or shift his defensive line, the human fleet had already anticipated the movement and adjusted. His formations were split before they could form. His retreat corridors were closed off before he ordered the retreat. San spent the engagement in the relay room, transmitting everything she could back to Drun Command. She transmitted the fleet numbers, the formation data, the engagement patterns, the jamming frequencies, the rate of advance. She was thorough and she was fast, and she did not stop transmitting until the installation's power grid was cut. In the silence after, she sat in the dark room and thought about what she had just watched. It had not looked like anger. That was the thing she kept returning to. She had expected something furious, a charge, a storm, the kind of attack that came from rage. What she had seen was different. It had looked like a problem being solved, methodical, focused, as though the humans on those ships were not acting out of emotion at all, but out of something quieter and more difficult to stop. She had grown up hearing that humans were a mid-tier civilization, capable, expanding, but nothing exceptional. She had believed it without question because there had never been a reason not to. She was revising that belief in real time. Crane's fleet regrouped at the edge of the system. Damage assessments were completed. Repairs were begun on the vessels that needed them. Crane walked the length of his command ship personally, checking in with section chiefs, looking at the numbers. When he returned to the bridge, he sat for a moment and then wrote a short message in plain text on a standard transmission band, the same band the Drun used for internal military communications. It said, "Verath's edge is no longer a Drun system. We are not stopping." He sent it to every Drun military frequency on record. Then he ordered the fleet to begin transit toward the next system on the list. The Arathi had a phrase that translated roughly as the quiet before understanding. It described the moment when something you believed was safe turned out not to be, not the fear that followed, but the few seconds before it, when the mind had received the information but had not yet processed what it meant. Council Speaker Jan of the Arathi Confederation used this phrase when speaking to his senior staff after the fall of Verath's edge. He stood at the head of their chamber, older than most of them by 2 decades, and said, "We are all in that quiet right now." 2 more Drun frontier systems fell within 6 days of Verath's edge. Neither had been defended as heavily as the first. The Drun had not yet redistributed their forces in time, but it would not have mattered if they had. The human fleet moved in ways that consistently broke the assumptions that military planning was built on. They hit from unexpected angles. They did not fight for territory, they fought for position, always putting themselves between the Drun and any meaningful counterattack vector before the engagement even began. More striking to outside observers was what the humans did not do. There were 3 civilian orbital platforms in the second system, mining stations, privately operated, with a few hundred Drun workers aboard. Crane's fleet held fire around all 3. They broadcast evacuation instructions on Drun civilian frequencies, calm, clear, translated perfectly, and gave the platforms 4 hours to move clear of the engagement zone before fighting began. All 3 platforms made it out. Jan had the record of that broadcast reviewed 3 times. He wanted to be certain he was reading it correctly. Humans had stopped a military operation to let civilians leave, not because treaty law required it, not because anyone was watching who could enforce it, because they had chosen to. He sent a private message to Secretary Eld. He asked one question: if the collective were to remove the individuals responsible for Director Hale's death and surrender them to a neutral tribunal, would humanity stop? Eld's reply took 4 hours. It was 1 paragraph. It said, Earth was not here to end the Drun collective. It was here to make clear what happened when an Earth leader was killed. Justice was the goal. Accountability was the method. If the collective wanted to discuss terms, they needed to begin by demonstrating that they understood what had happened at Station Verath and why. Jan read the message 3 times. Then he forwarded it to 7 other neutral civilization leaders without comment. They could read it themselves. Inside Drun High Command, the atmosphere had changed completely. High Warlord Breck had spent 40 years building the collective's military into a force that smaller civilizations stepped around carefully. He had won 2 conflicts before they became full wars simply by moving warships into a region and waiting. The galaxy had learned to read the positioning of Drun fleets the way a traveler reads weather, as a signal, not a threat, because the Drun always won when it became a threat. What was happening now had no category in his experience. His analysts kept giving him the same reports. The human fleet was engaging only military assets, maintaining discipline, suffering its own losses without retreating, and moving with a precision that implied planning far ahead of any single engagement. Breck asked his senior intelligence officer how long the humans could have been preparing this operation. The officer told him carefully that the timeline of the mobilization suggested preparation had begun within hours of Director Hale's death. Breck sat with that for a long time. Meanwhile, on Crane's command ship, life between engagements had its own rhythm. The crew ate together in shifts. The mess hall was loud in the way ships always were: compressed noise, conversations overlapping, the clatter of trays. Crane usually ate with his section chiefs, but twice a week he ate in the general mess with whoever happened to be there. He sat at the end of a table, ate what everyone else was eating, and listened more than he talked. His crew had learned not to stand up when he walked in. A young navigation officer had started teaching card games to the damage control crew during rest shifts. Someone had found an old handheld instrument in the supply stores and played it quietly in the crew quarters. Simple tunes, nothing complicated. Crane heard it one night and stopped outside the door for a moment, just listening. There was an Arathi observer aboard, a scholar named Hevra, arranged quietly by Jan to document the conflict for neutral records. She had expected to document a war. What she found was more complex. Human crews at war looked like any military from a distance. Up close they were different. They grieved their losses openly. She watched a senior engineer sit alone in a corridor for an hour after his closest colleague died. No one disturbed him. When he stood and returned to his station, no one commented. And yet they were the most effective combatants she had observed data on. She filed this to Jan. He sent it to the full council without comment. The Drun attempted their counterattack on the 4th day after the second system fell. It was a well-planned strike against a human supply corridor, fast ships, surprise timing, clean execution. Crane had anticipated it 12 days earlier. He had left a waiting force at that corridor specifically. The Drun strike force was intercepted before it reached its target. Breck was told about the failure in his command room. He did not respond for almost a minute. Then he ordered full forces to the home system. He was done trying to fight at the edges. The Drun home system had 4 planets, 2 of them inhabited, and a defensive network that Breck had spent 20 years building. It was the most heavily fortified position in collective space. Orbital platforms armed with long-range weapons, layered shield generators tied to the planet's own power grid, minefields seeded through the outer approach corridors, automated defensive stations positioned at every transit point, and behind all of it, the remainder of the Drun fleet, every warship that had not been lost in the outer systems, recalled and repositioned and waiting. Breck had stripped every other system to build this wall. He was not planning to stop the humans here and then push back. He was planning to stop them here entirely, make the cost so high that even Earth's anger would have limits. He told his commanders before the engagement began, "Make it expensive." Crane looked at the defensive map for a long time before he said anything. His senior staff stood around the display in silence, waiting. The layout was not a surprise. His intelligence teams had been building a picture of it for days using data from captured systems and information traded through the Arathi Observer's back channel. He had known it would be dense. Seeing the full picture confirmed that it was denser than the estimates. He pointed to 3 locations on the map and said, "Here, here, and here." Then he explained the plan in 12 minutes. His staff asked a combined total of 4 questions. He answered all 4. Then he told them to get some sleep because the transit would take 32 hours and the engagement after would not be short. Several of his commanders noted later that he had not asked if anyone was ready. He had assumed they were, and somehow that assumption had made them feel more ready than any speech could have. The battle lasted 19 hours. Crane lost more ships in the first 3 hours than in all previous engagements combined. The outer minefield was thicker than predicted. 2 cruisers were destroyed before the clearance teams finished their work. A strike from an orbital platform hit the port side of a destroyer so hard that half the crew section was lost. Damage reports came in continuously, and Crane read every one. He did not change the plan. What he had understood about the defensive layout, and what Breck had not fully accounted for, was that the wall was built to stop a direct charge. Every layer was designed to slow an incoming force down, bleed it, force it to stop and consolidate before pushing forward. It was a defense built on the assumption that the attackers would behave like attackers always had. Crane did not charge, he peeled. 3 separate groups of human ships worked the outer defenses from different angles simultaneously, not trying to break through, but forcing the Drun to spread their response. Then 2 more groups hit the gaps created by that spreading. Then the main force moved through those gaps while the Drun were repositioning. Each move created the condition for the next move. It was not improvisation. Every step had been planned before the fleet arrived. Breck watched his defensive line be dismantled piece by piece, and could not find the seam to push back against. On the surface of the second inhabited planet, General San had established ground operations 3 days earlier. Her forces had taken a Drun colony world in the outer systems, and were administering it while Crane handled the home defense. She had issued a single directive to all ground personnel: no civilian harm, no looting, no mistreatment of prisoners. Any violation would be prosecuted. Her soldiers held the line. They also, on the 3rd day, helped repair a water system damaged in the fighting because it served the civilian population. A Drun engineer stood nearby watching them work, too surprised to speak when a human sergeant asked through the translator if she wanted to point out anything they were doing wrong. Stories like this moved through Drun civilian channels faster than official news did. Back in the home system, the orbital platforms fell one by one through the night. The minefields were cleared in sections. The automated stations were disabled by focused electronic disruption rather than destroyed, a deliberate choice that reduced debris risk near the inhabited planets. Crane had thought about that too. By the 17th hour, Breck's remaining fleet was cornered against the inner planet. He broadcast a final address to his people, calling them to resist, calling the humans destroyers, calling for a fight to the last ship. Some of his commanders responded. Others did not. Several Drun captains, looking at the numbers, opened communication lines to Crane's fleet directly. Breck watched his final formation break apart from the inside. When the last orbital platform went dark, Crane's fleet had full control of the system's space. He positioned his ships in a complete encirclement of the home world and then stopped. He did not fire on the surface. He did not threaten the planet. He broadcast on all frequencies that Earth was prepared to discuss terms, that no further military action would occur while those discussions were open, and that harm to civilians would cause those discussions to end immediately. Breck was arrested by members of his own remaining council within the hour. Crane received the notification, read it, and told his crew to stand down from battle stations for the first time in 19 days. In the mess hall, someone started a noise that built slowly into something that was not quite cheering, more like exhaling. Crane sat in his chair on the bridge, looked at the planet on his display, and thought about the letter he still had not finished writing home. He pulled it up and started writing. Secretary Eld had never been to Station Verath before. He had seen the footage, of course. Everyone had. The wide chamber with the pale stone walls, the long table. The moment the sound came and Hale looked down at himself with that confused calm. Eld had watched that recording more times than he could count, not out of anger, though the anger was always there, but because he wanted to remember exactly what had been lost. Hale had been the best of what Earth tried to be. Patient, fair, willing to sit across from people who looked at him with contempt and still offer them a reasonable proposal. The chamber had been repaired. The stone had been cleaned. New panels had replaced the damaged sections of the floor. If you didn't know what had happened here, you wouldn't know. Eld arrived with a small team. Captain Moss was beside him. She had barely left his side since Crane's fleet secured the home system. Crane himself was present, in uniform but standing to the side, as he had insisted. He said the surrender was a political moment and should look like one. The Drun delegation that entered the chamber was not the same delegation that had been here before. Those individuals were either in custody or in hiding. The people who came now were the remaining council members, older, tired-looking, walking with the posture of those who had survived something they had not wanted to be part of but had not stopped either. Their lead representative was a woman named Dissy, who had served in the collective civilian government for 30 years and had been on record twice opposing the military faction's decisions. Eld met her in the center of the room. They did not shake hands. The Drun did not use that gesture. They stood at a respectful distance and looked at each other. Eld spoke first. He said Earth's terms were not designed to destroy the collective. He said he understood that entire civilizations could not be held responsible for decisions made by a small group of individuals in a closed room. He said the terms were as follows. Every individual who had planned, ordered, or knowingly concealed the assassination of Director Hale would be surrendered to a neutral tribunal, the composition of which would include Arathi, Venari, and 2 other species agreed upon by both sides. The Drun Collective would contribute to a reparations fund administered by the same tribunal, not to enrich Earth, but to support the reconstruction of the systems where fighting had occurred. All collective military activity in the contested star cluster would cease pending a new joint survey commission, and an external monitoring body would observe compliance for a minimum of 15 years. Dissy listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked one question. Would Earth guarantee the safety of the Drun civilian population during any transition period? Eld said yes without hesitation. Dissy nodded. She said the council accepted the terms. She said it quietly, without drama, with the tone of someone doing something painful but necessary. Eld accepted the response the same way, without triumph, without visible satisfaction. He just nodded and said they would begin the formal process. Ambassador Riva was brought into the chamber under escort 20 minutes later. He was not in the diplomatic clothes he had worn before. He looked older than the recordings suggested and smaller. He stood in front of the room and said nothing. Eld looked at him for a moment, then told the escort to take him to the tribunal transport. There was nothing Eld wanted to say to him. Moss watched Riva leave the room. The formal signing took most of the afternoon. There were documents to witness, registries to update, communications to send to every party that had been monitoring the situation. Council Speaker Jan attended via live transmission. He had not been invited but had sent a message asking if he could observe, and no one had objected. He sat on screen in his council chamber, very still, watching everything without comment. When the last document was signed, Eld asked for a few minutes alone in the chamber. The room cleared. Even Moss stepped outside, though she stood directly in front of the door. Eld sat at the table where Hale had sat. He put his hands flat on the surface the same way Hale had in the recording, the gesture Hale had always used when he was thinking through something difficult. Eld had picked it up without noticing, years ago, working alongside him. He sat like that for a while in the quiet room. Then he stood and went to the wall panel that his team had brought from Earth. It was a small thing, a dark metal plate, simply made. He positioned it himself on the wall near the window. When it was fixed in place, he stepped back and read it once. It said, Orrin Hale, Director of Earth's Unified Council. He came in peace. We finished what they started. Eld went outside. Moss fell into step beside him. Crane was waiting in the corridor with his hands behind his back. Done? Crane asked. Done, Eld said. They walked together toward the transport bay. Somewhere behind them, in the chamber with the pale stone walls, the station's environmental systems hummed quietly, and the stars outside the window stayed exactly where they always had been, distant, indifferent, and completely unchanged by everything that had passed between small civilizations moving through the space between them. But the galaxy that had watched all of it had changed. It had learned something it would not forget, that humanity could sit at a table and offer fair terms with one hand, and with the other, if you forced them to, hold the entire weight of what they were capable of. And they would not apologize for either.